Can't see any faces, but hello to those that are joining. Thank you for coming. We have quite a few people that registered, so we'll give it a minute to let people come in. Good morning to those. We still have lots of people coming in at the moment, so we'll give it one more minute. There's a sort of flood of people arriving. Okay, I think we may have slowed down on our folks arriving. Oh, hang on, a few more. Good morning. Okay, well, I think we'll begin and people can continue to come in. So good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Poverty, Childhood Experiences and Wellbeing in BC webinar. My name is Kate Bume. I'm a knowledge broker with the Human Early Learning Partnership, or HELP, at UBC. And this webinar is a partnership event between HELP and First Call Child and Youth Advocacy Society. Our two organizations have been longtime collaborators, and we're really pleased to be able to host this event online together today. So we'd like to begin by gratefully and respectfully acknowledging the territories on which we work, which for HELP on the Vancouver campus of UBC takes place on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam people and nation. And for First Call, the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, Stolo, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So gratefully recognizing their stewardships of these lands for millennia. And we'd really like to invite everyone to take a moment to consider the territories that you are calling in from this morning, and perhaps introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where are you calling in from, who you're connected to. We had interest about this session from across the province, so really grateful to all of you and would love to see where you're coming from in the chat. So just diving right into what we're going to talk about today, I'm going to begin the webinar with some brief introductory information. Then I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Martin Goon. And Dr. Goon is a longtime HELP faculty and associate professor in the School of Population and Public Health at UBC. He's also a member of the Canadian Council on the Social Determinants of Health. His research focuses on understanding how early childhood experiences and social, cultural, demographic, and socioeconomic context factors are related to children's development, health, well-being, and education. So we're definitely speaking in his wheelhouse today. He's going to talk about, he's going to introduce the concept of the social gradient and then demonstrate how it appears in data collected through the Child Development Monitoring System for Children and Youth in BC, and he'll explain a bit about that monitoring system. And then we'll follow that. Following Dr. Goon will be Adrienne Montani, who is the Executive Director of First Call Child and Youth Advocacy Society. She's been working with First Call since 2000, prior to which she has had many leadership roles, including as the Child and Youth Advocate for the City of Vancouver, Chairperson for the Vancouver School Board, Executive Directors of Surrey Delta Immigrant Services Society, and Big Sisters of BC Lower Mainland. She's a well-known and respected champion for children and their families, and you can see a list of the acknowledgements that she has received from a number of organizations on First Call's website. And we're going to be sharing some links as we go in the chat, so you can pick them up there, and also we'll share them out in a follow-up email if you missed them. So Adrienne's going to be presenting on some key highlights from the recently released 2023 BC Poverty Report Card by First Call, along with some advocacy success stories and some recommendations to continue to move the dial on ending child poverty. And then we'll wrap up with some time for Q&A and discussion. So just some quick notes. You will, as you logged in, notice that this webinar is being recorded, and the plan is to host the recording on the HELP website and perhaps the First Call website. And we'll let you know when that's available via a follow-up email. Also, a note that at the bottom of your screen, you should notice that a Q&A button along with a chat feature button. So if you have questions as you are listening, please type them into the Q&A, not the chat. So questions and Q&A, please. Use the chat to introduce yourself, use the chat to make comments, that's great, but keep your questions in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer as we go. We'll also hold some questions for the end so we can ask them live to our presenters today. So HELP is an interdisciplinary research center at UBC, and it was founded in 1999 by Doctors Clyde Hertzman and Hillel Goldman to explore the differences that make a difference in early childhood development. And through quality data collection and research with the goal to ultimately inform actions towards the idea of equity from the start for all children. And at HELP, our work is grounded in the understanding that children live, grow, play, and learn within many interconnected contexts, which impacts their development. And at HELP, we talk about this impact being from society to self. So these models provide a perspective on the various influences. One is from HELP, one is from the First Nations Health Authority. And just to explain a bit, certainly we think about that global context, the pandemic and climate change, two global phenomenons that definitely had an impact on the daily lives of children and families, continue to have impact. We can think of national and provincial policies influencing things like the economy, minimum wage, housing, and how those impact the daily lives of children, to community and neighborhood influences, including access to services, to land and green space, transportation, through to more immediate influences on the family, influences of family and of culture. And noting that the effects of colonization, systemic discrimination, and racism cross-cut these layers and across generations, such that access to opportunities and exposures to risks in the environments that children are living and growing and playing are not distributed equally. And one of those key risks to children's development is growing up in poverty, which is why we're hosting this webinar today. And for 2 decades, BC's child poverty rate hovered around 20 to 25%. So 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 children. And that rate was higher than the Canadian rate for 2 decades. So both HELP and First Call recognize that over the last 5 years, there have been very significant government investments and policy changes in support of children and families. And these include at the federal level things like increases to the Canada Child Benefit, an extension to parental leave to 18 months, though this doesn't fit for all families, it's not available to all families. And of course, the historic investment in and the very recent passing of Bill C-35, an act respecting early learning and childcare in Canada, which embeds the move toward a Canada-wide childcare system into law. During the pandemic, that was just in 2024, just recently. Moreover, during the pandemic, the Canadian government and the provinces did provide income relief programs on a scale similar to a guaranteed basic income, so major social investments during that time. So along with the federal government, we have BC, important shifts in BC, including being one of the first provinces outside of Quebec to move towards universal childcare, with some pilot $10 a day sites already in play, already making a major impact on families' lives. We see BC signing of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act in 2019 and the related action plans. The BC Child Opportunity Benefit, which has been renamed the BC Family Benefit, and I think Adrian will touch on that a little bit later. In 2019, we had BC's first ever poverty reduction strategy, first ever 2019, but that's great. We can look to the BC Early Learning Framework, which supports curriculum and play-based learning from the early years into the school, the primary years into the school years, and the move of the Ministry of the Ministry of Education to the Ministry of Education and Childcare, acknowledging that early learning is part of the whole education journey. So pointing these out, not to say that all targets and needs have been met and we're good, but rather to say there have been some significant shifts moving in the right direction to support children and families. In fact, during the pandemic, Canada's child poverty rate dropped by 40%. And Campaign 2000, which is the National Poverty Coalition, notes that this progress was largely due to those temporary pandemic benefits, which of course have ended. And during the same period, BC's child poverty rate dropped from 1 in 5 down to 1 in 8, so a significant reduction. So it seemed like things were moving in the right direction. And that's our little trailer teaser for what's coming. It seemed. Wait for more. So to wrap up my introduction, and before we move into a lot of graphs and numbers, we just wanted to bring some of the voices of families that First Call captures in their reports that speak to the daily experiences of those living on low incomes and in poverty. So I'm just going to read a couple of them. For example, my son's asthma medication is not covered, and my disability checks aren't enough to make ends meet. I skip meals, or I have a slice of toast so that I can have money for my son's needs. My family takes transit. By the time I take my children to school and daycare in different locations and then bus to work, it takes me 2 hours. I'm spending 4 hours a day commuting on transit because there are no daycare spots available close to home or work. The heat wasn't working and overnight temperatures were near zero. My children had to sleep in my bed. It took 2 weeks for the landlord to replace the furnace. When your rent is below market value, you keep quiet and make yourself agreeable. It's now impossible to buy all the provisions we need, so we buy the cheapest food and eat the same meals over and over. This is demeaning and not good for children's health. Fresh foods are extremely expensive. There's a ton more in the reports that First Call puts out, whether they're about housing or making ends meet, and we'll put the links to those reports in the chat, and we encourage you to take a look. And with that, I'm going to wrap up my section and invite Dr. Goon to share his slides and begin his part of the presentation.
Okay. Hi, everyone. I hope you can hear me. That's the most important. You can see the slides. Can I get another thumbs up for the slides? Okay. Thanks a lot, Kate, for the setup and the preparation and for bringing us together here and doing the introduction. Yeah, I'm very, very happy and excited to have this opportunity to have this discussion and looking forward to questions and comments later on. I'll talk for about 20 minutes about the early years, why they matter based on the research evidence that we have, how they're related to income disparities, income inequalities, and why that may matter. And then, of course, before passing it on to Adrian, kind of make some connections to why thinking about poverty and income inequality matters when in light of what we know about the early years. If there are questions or comments, I hope somebody will be able to flag me down. If I don't see or hear anything, I'll just go through this for the next 20 minutes, but please interrupt or post your questions if you have any. So I'll start by talking about a concept that Kate already alluded to, the social gradient in health or socioeconomic gradient in health, which in essence is an observation or a term for an observation about the inequalities in socioeconomic status and how they are related to inequalities in population health. Or in other words, we have differences in socioeconomic status, such as income and education, and those differences in SES, they're related to differences or variability in the health that we observe in our population. I'll illustrate this by using a graph. This is Canadian data, looking at life expectancy. And at the horizontal axis at the bottom, you see the 5 income quintiles going from lowest income to highest income. And on the vertical axis, you see the life expectancy plotted in, or the age plotted in years, going from the low 70s to the 80s. And just pause for a second and think how much you think there may be a variability in life expectancy with regard to whether people grow up in lower income or higher income quintiles. And in case you wondered or guessed that there is a difference, here is the actual data for Canadian men 2005. You see that there's around a 5-year difference going from the lowest income to the highest income quintile. The jump is most pronounced going from the lowest to the next quintile, but we see that it's a steady increase across the 5 income quintiles. We don't only see this in Canada, we see the same thing also when you look at life expectancy internationally. So what you see here is a graph that plots what they call consumption expenditure, which is basically in socioeconomic status or income measure by country at the horizontal axis, going all the way from 0 up to $40,000. And then on the other axis, on the vertical axis, you see life expectancy at birth on average for the population in that country. And what you see is that when you're going from very low consumption expenditure, a couple of thousands, to something like a maybe low or to middle income country, you see a very, very steep increase in life expectancy going from below 60 to the mid 70s. And then as you go from the middle income to high income, you still see an increase, but it's not as pronounced, in terms of the benefit of having additional dollars. And that's what's in the literature sometimes to refer to as diminishing return. So think of it this way: the effect of going from having almost nothing, so at the very left side of this graph, to having a little or maybe middle income countries, you see a very, very pronounced increase in life expectancy. But then as you're going from having enough or middle income to high income, maybe more than enough, you don't see that there's an equivalent increase. There's still an increase, but it's not at the same rate or the same steepness. So having briefly taken a look at the definition of, or this phenomenon of, a socioeconomic gradient in health, let's take a look at data for the BC context and also some pan-Canadian examples, and focus on children, which of course is our focus here at HELP. We have been collecting data on children's experiences, on their ecologies, their social contexts, and of course also on their health and well-being outcomes with these different tools, and you'll get a few examples from all of them. A quick commercial break, and if you have follow-up questions on this, please reach out, especially to Kate, but of course anyone at HELP, to point you into further directions. But we have new data dashboards, so if anyone is interested in playing and exploring our data, they're up on our website for the EDI, which of course are the teacher ratings, kindergarten teacher ratings on how kids are doing, and then student self-report on the MDI. Very, very interesting and well-designed resource for anybody to access on our website. So I'll here just focus on a couple examples to set up some of the discussion around the early years and early experience by looking at our EDI data. Of course, EDI has been one of the flagship projects here at HELP with ministry support for over 20 years. We have seen what we call a vulnerability rate of around 33% for the last wave of data collection. But what's maybe more important than the actual rate is the range, the variability that we see. So when you look at these data by school district, we see that some districts have vulnerability rates in the low 20s and some over 50, 60, in the most extreme case, even over 70% vulnerability. So huge discrepancy in vulnerability rates when you go from one school district to the next. We see an even more pronounced range when you look at the neighborhood, a smaller unit of aggregation, with some neighborhoods having vulnerabilities as low as the low teens, 13% for that wave. And then the maximum is the same as the highest vulnerability rate for one of the school districts with over 70. You can map these things, which for us has been a fabulous communication tool, because you can talk about children who are living in a specific area. So if you go to Surrey and talk to stakeholders, professionals, educators, health professionals in Surrey, they may want to know how their kids are doing. And so here you have a map showing the variability going from one neighborhood to another within the Surrey context. And you see that on the north side and the west side, there's a couple of neighborhoods that are portrayed in darker red, which means higher vulnerability rates, over 40%. And then you see some that have a lighter kind of reddish, red-brownish color, demonstrating or representing that they have vulnerability rates that are closer to 20 or low 20s in terms of vulnerability rates. So again, huge variability within cities, going from one neighborhood to the next. And if you juxtapose this with the poverty map, and of course you'll hear Adrian talk later, this is taken from the first call poverty maps based on census tract. And not sure if you see the same thing. We can't interact that well over Zoom, but if I were to ask you, do you see a similar pattern? On the poverty map, you see that darker grays represent higher rates of poverty, and the light gray represents lower rates of poverty. And if you put the two side by side, you may see that some of the areas that have high vulnerability rates on the EDI also have high poverty rates. So there seems to be a systematic pattern here. We have been able to analyze this for the pan-Canadian context. What you see here is a bubble plot, with each bubble representing a neighborhood for which we have data in the pan-Canadian context. So multiple provinces, territories are in this graph. And on the horizontal axis, you again have the median income for each of these neighborhoods. And on the vertical axis, you have the EDI vulnerability. And what you see is that at the low end of the income spectrum, on average, the neighborhoods have higher vulnerability rates than they have on the high income rate. And if you were to draw a line into this, you also see that the probably increase of vulnerability is more pronounced at the very low end of the income spectrum, and flattens out just a little bit towards higher income. So same gradient that I showed you for life expectancy within Canada, and also for an international context, we already see when you look at child development outcomes at a relatively early age. With our check data, on which we ask parents to report on the social context and experience of their kids, we also ask about household income. So we have caregiver or parent-reported income, and we can link it directly to whether their children are rated as vulnerable or not on the EDI. And you see an equally, maybe even more pronounced stark relationship between income. So you go on the horizontal axis from under 50,000 household income annually all the way to over 150, and the vulnerability rate is over 45 for the lowest income bracket, and around 20% for the highest income. So a very strong difference going from the one end of the spectrum to the other. So a big question, of course, is from a pragmatic or an action orientation perspective, is when and how does this socioeconomic gradient emerge, and what could we possibly do about it once we understand that? I'll use an example that I think is quite brilliant to illustrate a key mechanism here and raise some important questions, taken from the report that's called Fair Society and Healthy Lives, written by Michael Marmot and his team, based in this particular case on data from the UK from over a generation ago, but you'll see that we see similar patterns elsewhere. So what they did in this particular study is they looked at children's pre-verbal and then verbal skills and called it a cognitive score. And then they were able, based on these scores, to separate these children to groups of children that were doing quite well, so they put them in the high cognitive score range, and then you have other kids who had a low cognitive score at 22 months of age, so this is approximately 2 years of age. And then they also, based on the information they collected, they knew whether they were growing up in high socioeconomic status environments or low socioeconomic status environments, and they put these children into these groups accordingly. And then what they saw over time, so they now measure these verbal skills age appropriately over time, and what they're finding is that the children who started high and are growing up in high SES environments, they stayed relatively high compared to the rest of the group. The children who started with a low score and grew up in low SES environments, this is the light green, the bottom line here, over time they stayed relatively low compared to, but then they found something else quite interesting. The group that started high, but grew up in low SES and family environment, over time, they fell behind in comparison to the rest of the group. And the group that started low but grew up in high SES environment, over time they were catching up. So by the end of their study period, you know, at the time the kids were 10 years old, all the children in the high SES environments, they started to look more and more alike over time, and in terms of their cognitive scores, and the ones growing up in low SES environments started to look more and more alike. We find something similar when you analyze the data here for the BC context. In our particular study, we were able to link birth factors and SES information with both data on the EDI and data looking at mental health diagnosis from administrative health records. And what we found is that the socioeconomic status indicators, such as growing up in poverty, living in a lone parent household, which of course restricts the resources, the time you can dedicate, you know, to raising your children, and growing up in a neighborhood that's characterized by higher levels of poverty. Those were the stronger predictors than the ones that indicate how children are doing developmentally at birth. There's an Apgar score, preterm birth, cesarean section. So they're developmental risk factors, but they were not as predictive SES predictors that we could also measure. So similar pattern to what I showed you earlier. If you want to have the strongest predictor for outcomes down the road, the SES environment seems to have a stronger influence over time. And of course, the question is, what links SES or income or other indicators of socioeconomic status so strongly to these health outcomes, even at a young age? So if you think of social determinants of health, and income as an example, and then on the right side, you have child development well-being outcomes, the question is, what's happening in that connection that we need to understand to maybe make a difference? And the evidence from the literature is relatively clear. We need to understand how income and other SES factors affect the daily experiences of children and families, and those in turn affect their well-being and developmental outcomes. I'll say a few words about what's happening in early brain development. It's quite fascinating. We know this from studies with humans, but also from animal research. The brain, of course, is genetically programmed to develop, but it really demands that there is good environmental kind of input in order for us to see well, for our vision to develop accurately. We need visual stimuli, and they're especially important during the early years. For our hearing to develop, intrauterine and postnatal environment in terms of the acoustic stimuli socially interacting with sound is critical for our hearing to develop. Language can only develop if there are people talking to us during the early years. From orphanage studies, we know that if there is no interaction verbally with caregivers, children are not developing language. So all to say is the developing brain demands, absolutely needs environmental stimuli in order for making the right kind of neural connections in order to develop functional brain structures. when you look at the neural connections in the brain, it's quite fascinating. At birth, there are few neurons. You see this on the left panel. By age 6, you see that there has been enormous proliferation of dendritic growth, of neural growth, of all these connections. And that happens during all these sensitive periods of brain development. And then later on, you see during adolescence that there are now fewer connections. That's because nature likes efficiency, and some of the connections that are not functional or not needed, they're getting pruned, and the brain only holds on to the ones that are efficient and functional. And at that point, our brain loses a fair amount of its plasticity. It's not completely gone, but it's severely reduced. So this is not only happening for brain development, but research shows our hormonal system, the neuroendocrine system, is requiring positive early experience in order to develop functionally. The immune system requires positive early experience in order to function. The same with the metabolic system, cardiovascular system. And if children grow up in very adverse environments, some of these functions may be disrupted and affect health and outcomes throughout the life. Here's a good summary sentence from a report that was written by the Harvard Center on the Developing Child. Very good website and source in case you're interested. So this sentence talks about the relationship between early experiences and later health outcomes. I'll read it because I think it's quite good to pause and take it in. So the environments that we create and the experiences we provide for young children and their families affect not just the developing brain, but also many other physiological systems, from cardiovascular function and immune responsiveness to metabolic regulation. And this is quite profound insight, because when you look at different indicators of whether we as humans are doing well across a lifespan, many of them can be correlated with adverse or positive experience during the early years. So if you have adverse experiences during childhood, a lot of stress, more likely to experience school failure, teen pregnancy, criminality in the late teens or early adolescence. We see higher rates of obesity, depression. We see higher rates of coronary heart disease, diabetes, and other chronic health outcomes. And then all the way into old age, things such as Alzheimer and dementia all have correlation with adverse experiences and stress environments during the early years. Just checking with time.
You're good on time. And maybe while I have you, I'll ask a question that came in the chat from what you just presented. Can we do that?
How much of the pruning effect, age 6 versus age 14, is due to our Western schooling of young people? Have similar studies confirmed such pruning among populations of unschooled youth? Here, I'll just go back to the here panel. So thanks, Randy. Yeah. Well, I don't think I know the answer to what extent we may see differences in this regard, depending on what the environmental differences are. One thing that I'm relatively certain, and we know this both from the human experience, also from animal research, is the brain genetically for our species is set up to have this proliferation of growth during the early years. And then there's also genetic predisposition for becoming more efficient and for pruning. So I think that's universal. But I think what is a very important point here in your question, if I'm reading it correctly, is cultural diversity and cultural differences, of course, affect what kinds of experiences children are having while they're growing up. And those in turn are absolutely critical for what types of connections in the brains are thriving, which ones are strengthened, and which ones aren't. So yes, there's differences culturally. And we know that, for example, language development or the way children think is different for societies. There are studies that were done in the, I think, late 1900s, late 19th century or early 20th century, comparing societies where there was no literacy due to not going to school. And you see that there is differences in terms of thinking and how people memorize things. I couldn't tell you to what extent that's reflected in brain differences, but probably there's a correlate. I hope that's in line with the question you're asking. And I appreciate it. It's a fascinating area. I can't see you, Randy, so I'm hoping it's good. Kate, if you don't have any follow-up, let me know. Oh, Mari, thank you for this presentation. Hi, Mari. I wonder about social cohesion in neighborhood and to what extent this could mitigate some of the adverse effects of poverty for children and their families. Yeah, it almost feels as if your question is planted, Mari, because we have a little bit of information on things that relate to social support. And yes, even though I don't have let me see it one more time. Social cohesion neighborhoods. Yes, we do see, in fact, we did a study with EDI results. When you look at social capital data, you see that the lower income neighborhoods that, as we shared, as we looked at, that have higher vulnerability rates here on the low end of the income spectrum. Once you also look at social capital or social support, we see that some of that variability, because you see at the low end of the income, we see some neighborhoods that have relatively high vulnerability rates, some that have relatively low ones. And the ones that have relatively low vulnerability rates and low income, they were more likely to have relatively high degree of social capital. The question, of course, then where is that coming from? And sometimes it has cultural or historical reasons. But all to say is yes, the social dynamics are absolutely fundamental. And this is the question we'll also be getting towards by looking at some of the data that I've prepared for today. What type of social experiences and context matter, and how do they relate to income and other things? So I'll go back to where I was. Any other questions? I'm looking at all this moving screens. And Kate, all good? Okay.
And maybe carry on, and we'll hold some questions for the end.
Okay, so yeah, last part of this presentation, and I hope you find this interesting, and also sets up the discussion by Adrian, just happening in a few minutes. We have collected data on children's day-to-day experience in BC, and I'll show you some data, especially how they relate to income inequality, and to what extent we see a connection between income and these childhood experiences that research says are important. I'll pull from the different tools. TDI and Check are caregiver or parent reported about their young children. EDI, you already heard me talk about. MDI and YDI is the student's voice. It's the children's or the youth voice themselves. So it's a student questionnaire, and I'll give you some examples from all those. So here's TDI, parents of toddlers. We ask them, how often does a caregiver parent in your household get to read or tell stories with your child? 1 or more times a day. And then we plotted this against the income level. And what you see is you go from left, low income, to right, high income, and the frequency goes up stepwise. So that we can make a connection between what Adrian will talk about to some extent in terms of poverty and living wage. You see that in families that are above the living wage range, that these things are happening. almost 100% or in large majority, whereas you see that there's a drop off in percentages as you go towards a lower income, especially once you fall below the poverty line. And what we were completely struck by is you look at every single question on the TDI or the other tools, and we see a gradient. Water consumption, highly recommended by public health, lower consumption of water multiple times a day in the low income than the high income. Immunizations, which are kind of in principle provided for free in the public health system here in BC. We see lower rates in the low income, higher rates in the high income. You look at whether children had their teeth checked by a professional. Lower rates again in the low income, and almost everybody in the higher income, once you get above living wage, has had their teeth checked by a professional. Now we ask parents of kindergarten children, same question about reading books, telling stories. You see the same gradient. You go from low income to high income, frequency goes up. You look at neighborhood support and I think, Mari, that partially it's not a response to your question, but it's just a piece of information to dig deeper. What about neighborhood support, social support? And we see that is also actually correlated to income. You see that parents who live in low income environments, low household income environments, have lower frequency of saying there is strong social support than the ones who are in high income environments. Screen time, of course, strong recommendation from public health to limit this for young children especially. We see, unfortunately, high rates in general across the board. That's an issue, but we see that the rates are more dramatic for the low income families than for the ones that are in the high income brackets. Now to the MDI, which is a student self-report tool, a questionnaire. This is data from grade 4. We create an index of whether kids are thriving according to their own responses, and you see an income gradient going from around 40% to 46%, maybe not as pronounced as some of the others, but it's there. When you ask them about participation in organized activities, we see an income gradient, lower free participation rates in the lower income than the higher income, maybe for more obvious reasons because it involves costs and time and access. And this is finally some preliminary analyses from the YDI, the Youth Development Instrument. And we see same pattern when you ask youth to what extent they agree that they have opportunities for skill development outside of school. So these would be job skills and skills to care for others. And you split it by income group, low, medium, high, you see that there's a strong gradient. So children, youth in higher income groups report more frequently that they have these opportunities. You ask them whether teachers, students in the school treat each other with respect, you see the same income gradient. So all to say is we did expect, and in some instances when financial resources are directly involved, we're not surprised that we see an income gradient for these experiences. What we were struck by, and not just our health team, we have been sharing these findings with a lot of stakeholders over the years in the communities as they've been coming out. And a lot of people have been surprised by the sometimes steepness or kind of dramatic correlation between income and all of these experiences that we know are important for developmental health. And with that, I'm turning it over to you, Adrian. Thank you very much.
Martin, before we let you go, there was one question in the chat about if there's any information specific to dental health outcomes in poverty. You did mention about having teeth cleaned as one.
Yeah.
But I wondered if you had anything else to add to that, dental health?
Yeah, in fact, one of the maps that I think probably helped get help off the ground, Clyde had a dental cavities map, I think late 90s or early 2000s, showing that the prevalence of cavities or untreated cavities was several factors higher among low-income children than the rest. And we have other evidence pointing in the exact same direction. So is that the question? Yes. So we do see a strong correlation between income and dental health. Yes, for sure.
Yes. And last one, and then we'll turn it to Adrian.
Yeah.
A note about the MDI and YDI. Are children aware of the income levels of their families, which is interesting. Where does that income data come from?
Yeah, thanks. I didn't mention that. But for the MDI, we don't have income information from the children. I should have mentioned this is neighborhood level income data. So we know where children go to school and where they live. And so we can plot it against the census data for the YDI. These are now children grade 10, 11, 12. You can ask them a question about certain resources that they have in their daily lives or in their household, and they, in other research, have been shown to be fairly good proxies of socioeconomic status in the family. So we have used that information. So in this particular case, it's the student self-report, and MDI was census neighborhood data. I hope that answers the question. Thanks.
Great, thank you. And now we'll invite Adrian to join. Great.
There we go. Can you see it okay? The slides?
Yes, looks good.
Okay. So thanks. Yeah, thanks to everybody who's joined this. Thank you, Martin, for a fascinating presentation. Looking forward. So I'm going to run through a bunch of data here from our report card fairly quickly, but I want to raise some key facts. But just if you aren't familiar and haven't read First Call's Child Poverty Report Card, it's an annual report we do. This 2023 one uses 2021 data, so I'll be referring to that throughout because there's a lag in when we get the tax filer data. But this is our 27th annual Child Poverty Report Card. And so we present some evidence about the scope and the depth of child and family poverty. And it's meant to inform government, public as well, of course, but we want government action to reduce child and family poverty. So we hope that this report is a tool for any of you on this call and lots of other people to support advocacy and to mobilize, whether it's through an organization or individual conversations and communities, to sort of use this in advocacy to reduce child poverty. So what we do as a society at First Call, we send it to every elected MP and MLA in British Columbia. And we encourage you all to take a look at it, share it as well with your networks. Write to your elected representatives in support of the recommendations in the report, if you support them, or just the ones there's 25, we'll get to that later, but there's a lot of recommendations in here. But just if there's some that really resonate with you, please give them your voice or your support and let your elected representatives know about that, or share the data in the report with people who are making decisions about children's lives. So just some high-level takeaways here. I'll be revisiting each of these a bit, but certainly some key facts to pay attention to was that in this report, it's 2021 data, and it shows an uptick in the child poverty rate and from the previous year in 2020, and that is evidence of the withdrawal of pandemic benefits like CERB and other things that were rolling out as income supports during the highest during 2020, when there was a lot of action to try and support families during the pandemic's worst times. The poverty rate, though, is gone back up. It's 126,000 children, and as Martine has demonstrated, there's real outcomes for this. So we consider this deserving of urgent action. So to reduce the child and family poverty rate. Again, relating to the help data around income inequality and its impacts that we're seeing on children's experiences and children's vulnerabilities. I'll talk about that a bit. We also have evidence that in the report card. And just one of the groups with the highest poverty rate, we'll go into this in a bit more detail, is that children in lone parent families are one of the highest risk groups of all. So digging a little deeper into the poverty, the graphs and stuff from the report, the data. So 1 in 7 children were poor in 2021, and this is after tax data measured against a poverty line that we call the Census Family Low Income Measure. And you can see that BC, in comparison to other provinces and compared to Canada, is not doing too bad. We are now the 3rd in terms of poverty rate, or the 3rd lowest, and we are now better than the Canadian rate. But it was still 126,000 children. Here you can see this, so still 126,000 children, and sorry, I'm just moving my screen around so I can see what I'm talking about. So that's 14% poverty rate, and that's better than the Canadian rate now, and that wasn't always the case. So this is some of the good news in this first slide. Also, that we always track the poverty rate for children under 6, because again, relating to the help data and what we know about the importance of those early years in brain development and social development. So we track under, and so there was about, just over 37,000 poor children in the province in this year who were under 6, but their poverty rate was a little bit better than the overall child poverty rate. And that's good because, again, tracking this historically, we used to see that the under 6 poverty rate was in fact higher than the over, so that families raising very young children had higher poverty rates than the overall rate for children of 0 to 17. And that's reversed a bit in this last year or 2, I would say. So that's good news as well, because those are incredibly important years. And we always measure it against or show the all ages poverty rate here. So again, this is tracking what happened historically. It used to be that child poverty was higher than the all ages poverty rate. And again, now it's a bit lower, at least in BC, not in Canada. But again, this is good news. So we know that historically what it's showing is that child poverty rates in BC certainly have been coming down faster than the all ages poverty rate. So that's good news for children and families and their families. So here's the over time graph, and the report is done into fact sheet. So this is fact sheet 5. I think, let's look quickly. Yeah, no, sorry, this is fact sheet 2. Anyway, so you can see the range over time for BC and Canada. Sorry, and Canada. And you can see that they kind of converge eventually. So we were always worse than Canada for a long time, and then in the last decade or so, it's come down. And you can see this big drop in between 2019 and 2020. And again, that's reflective of the income supports that went directly to families and benefits. And that's why the big drop. And then you can see the uptick there in 2021 as those benefits started to be withdrawn. There's still some, and when you look into the report, you can see exactly how much difference the pandemic benefits made in child poverty reduction, as well as other factors that do that. So basically what we know is that when families' income from work is unable to lift them over the poverty line, or if they're on income assistance from benefits, that government transfers like the COVID benefits and Canada Child Benefit have been doing the heavy lifting. They have a very direct impact on income supports, can make a big difference. And I'll cover that again as we get through these. And just a little historical stuff. We've been tracking this since there was a House of Commons unanimous commitment to end child poverty by the year 2000. And that was made in 1989, and we're not there yet. So we're still working on it. So underneath the overall 14% child poverty rate, we always want to dig down a little bit deeper and look at populations that are overrepresented or have a higher risk of poverty. So the chart on the left of this slide is from the Canadian census, the 2021 census. So it's a 2020 data. It's a year older than most of the other data in this report. But you can see for racialized children and racialized families that about 7 of the ones selected here had higher poverty rates. 7 different racialized groups had higher poverty rates than the overall child poverty rate, which in 2020, because of the drop during the pandemic, was only about 13%, but you can see some were higher than that. And then the second graph to the right of the slide here is we get a snapshot every year from the tax filer data of just a small number of the First Nations reserves in BC. So in this year, it was 67 reserves, and we can break it down by urban and rural reserves, but you can see again the much higher rate for this particular snap. We can't generalize this to all reserves because really it is just a snapshot, but of those 67 First Nations reserves that we had data for this time, it was a 31% poverty rate, which is obviously much higher than 14%. And you can see the difference that the poverty is deeper or more prevalent on the rural reserves as opposed to the urban reserves. And so when we look under the hood of digging down into the data a bit more than just the overall child poverty rate, these statistics give us the evidence that there are a range of systemic factors affecting that affect some families much more than others, and that would include experiences of discrimination, the legacy of colonization, and some of this, especially with the racialized families, some of that's capturing new immigrant data. So some of that is maybe just being new to Canada and not having your economic feet under you. But it can also be compounded by discrimination, lack of access to supports like access to learning English. And for instance, if you're a mother raising children and you want access to English language training, but there's no childcare attached, you might wait years before you can actually get into an English language class, and maybe until your children are in school or something like that. So that's where we get into the fine points of how do the policy recommendations that we're making reach into the nuanced needs of different communities. So this is where we get into the other group I mentioned in that one of those early slides, that children in lone parent families have a very, very high risk of being in poverty. So it's 40% risk in 2021. And you can see the big difference in this over time graph between children in lone parent families and children in two parent families. And that's been, over time, for this is 19 years worth of data. You can see that for children in lone parent families, it was more than 1 and 2. It was more than 50% risk until 2019. It finally came down to 49%. And so the difference between the two is in 2021 was about a 5.5 times ratio for if you were born into or living in a two-parent family as opposed to a lone parent family. So much higher risk. Children in lone parent families, there is another graph in the report card that you can look at. The number of children or the percentage of children in BC who live in lone parent families in 2021 was 1 in 5, or about 20%, but they make up 57% of the poor children. So there's that overrepresentation that you can see. And 80% of those lone parent families in that year were female-led. So you can see the numbers there. In 2021, there were 68,000 some odd children in parent families who were poor, compared to 52,550 children who were in lone parent families. And both of those figures went up from 2020 to 2021. There's another group that's not shown on the slide here either, but this is tracking by family type. They're called census families, 2-parent, 1-parent, but there's another group that are called, they're 0 to 17-year-olds who are not in census families. It's in BC, that would be just over about 5,000 young people, and they're not captured in this graph because they're not in this kind of family types. It's sort of people who, the way the census describes it is that they're living with non-relatives or people who aren't related to them. They might be living on their own. This might include some young people who are themselves teens, still they're under 18, but they might be a parent. So and they have a poverty rate, that small group of you, of 98%. That's consistent across many years. It's been very, very high. So this, just to keep those in mind, that would be some young people we should really be paying attention to. And just again, not shown here on the slide, but to give you some, Martine was talking about the gradient or the range between some of the poverty or the SES differences across and the outcomes. So just if you look at the lone parent poverty rate, children in lone parent families, overall in BC it was 40% in 2021, but the lowest in the province for lone parent was in Victoria, and that was still 34%, and it was as high as 48% in Prince Rupert. So when we get down into municipal data, we can see that there's still that's a 14 percentage point difference for lone parent children in those, or the rate of poverty in those two municipalities. And if there's an aggregate number for lone parent children in rural areas that aren't captured in any of the urban data, and that poverty rate was 46% for it. So these would be really rural and remote communities, children in lone parent families. For children in couple families, so you see the big difference there. The range there is smaller, but it was the lowest was in Trail, at least the cities we have data for, was Trail at 3%, and 9% was the highest in Port Alberni, but the overall average was 7.4%. So just to give you an idea that even within these, there's still, it's interesting depending on where you live to look into the deeper data. And then when we're looking at families as single parents, raising children, one of the things to know, I'm going to read a quote from from the report, because there are different policy issues that affect them and trap them in poverty. So here's a unique one. Children in BC are being raised in poverty. This is a single mother's report, due to our family court and family maintenance system's failure to collect child support. My child's father hides income and lives a comfortable lifestyle while we barely get by on my single income. I can't afford to pay $10,000 in legal fees to go to court again. Legal aid is of no help as they only deal with emergencies. In my opinion, children needlessly living in poverty is an emergency. So that's one mother's comment on how, what her own circumstance. There was in the most recent budget some additional funding, expanded access, some I think additional hours through legal aid and for family law. And they're going to, by the end of this year, I think there's a family law clinic model that's going to be opening up. It was just announced in February. So hopefully that will start addressing some of this particular inequity that's showing up here. So that's again the kind of drilling down into the policy nuances that really would impact and help families get out of this. So one important point to remember is that most poor children, the majority of poor children in the province in all the years that we've studied it, have parents who are in the workforce. So the majority, they're either in their full-time full year, or they're working in precarious work part-time, when they really could use full-time work, or part year, or in some kind of precarious work. So what we have in this graph is if you had a parent, and there's two different family types, a lone parent with one child and a couple family with two children, if they were all those parents were working full-time at minimum wage in 2021, they would be still much below the poverty line. And this is a before tax poverty line, because we're looking at wages before taxes are applied or benefits are applied. So minimum wage basically has never yet provided a family supporting wage. And so we call on government and all employers to pay family supporting living wages, because but even when families, and again, this would certainly affect single parent families, even when they get a job that pays a living wage, they may not have an annual income that lifts them above the poverty line because they can't work full time. And that's why I've put something up for childcare, just a reminder of the importance, and I'll revisit this again at the end of my talk, but that if you can't get affordable childcare and you're a single parent, you're really, especially during school age, and this came up a lot in a report we also published last year called the Making Ends Meet report. We interviewed a bunch of low-income families who were working, and when their children are school age, they still can't go to school, back to work full time if they don't have childcare, because they basically can only work during school hours. They have to do school pickup and drop off, and so it's really limiting their income and their ability to earn enough to make ends meet in their when they don't have access. So that's especially crucial for low-income single parent families, but it affects. In the quote here in the slide is a two-parent family. Still, they don't have a car. They're doing all this traveling and transportation just to get back and forth because they could get their children into childcare, but they're still having lots of challenges. So then we look at children in families on income assistance, and there's a couple of graphs here I want to unpack for you. So the total income, what the graph on the left is showing you. So this is about 30% of the poor children in 2021 were on income assistance, whether their parents were on disability assistance or at the other income assistance stream. And you can see by two different family types how far below the poverty line their total welfare incomes left them. So 11,000 or almost $12,000 for the single parent with one child, and over $12,000 gap for the families with two children, the couple families with two children. So, and this is about represents about 42,000 children on average throughout that year were on income assistance. For most of these families, working was not an option. So 64% of them were not categorized as expected to work because they had medical conditions, they had multiple barriers, they had disabilities or other challenges that prevented them from working. 84% of these families were on assistance, that were on assistance with children were led by lone parents. So again, you can see the overlap of some of the vulnerabilities or issues that affecting children in lone parent families again. And in the last few years, there have been some increases from BC in the child welfare rates for income assistance. Has gone up, and you can see that in the other graph here on this slide. So but again, that big steep, so it started to go up, you can see around 2014, 15, there were increases in total welfare incomes. When I say total welfare incomes, I want to say this isn't just the income from welfare benefits or social assistance and PWD benefits. It also includes the child tax benefit and GST rebates and stuff. So the total welfare income that a family would qualify for and be able to keep. So it might include so any government transfers that we'll talk about a bit later. So, and you can see the big increase in between 2019 and 2020. Some of that was a permanent increase in the rates, in the welfare rates in BC, but some of it was pandemic benefits that families were allowed to keep in that year. It was also at the provincial level, so there were federal benefits coming, but there were also provincial benefits that were one-time enhancements to support families during the first year of the pandemic. So again, those dropped off. And so for the first time, because what this chart over time shows is adjusted for inflation, what's the value of the total welfare incomes for these families by family type. And it actually went down, adjusted, that it lost value or lost buying power in between 2020 and 2021. But you can see again, the gap in the other graph, the gap to reach the poverty line is around $12,000 a year or over. So it's a lot. And then when we look at that gap again we look at depth of poverty in fact sheet 4 in the report card, you can see there that again, this gap, it's anywhere from $12,000 to close to $14,000 gap. Just so they'd have to earn, these families would have to earn over $1,000 a month more just to get to the poverty line for these 4 different family types. So that's what's being illustrated here. And I just want to remind you that this is a median. So these are median income figures. So, for the couple with 2 children, the 34,800, or the one lone parent, the 22,000 in the gray part of the graph there is the median income of all the poor families in that family type, the poor families. So median means in the middle. And so half of those families are making less than that figure. So their gap to reach the poverty line would be much greater even. So sometimes sometimes people might have an impression that, well, poverty isn't really that deep or it's not that bad here in our wealthy province and our wealthy country. It actually, there are some families who are very, very poor. To put it in some context, there's a chart with, and I'll get into this in the a little bit later, but for the poorest 10% of families, the average after-tax income in 2021 was just over $11,000 a year. And for the richest family, richest 10% of families, it was $282,500 a year. So that's a 25 times ratio. So between the lowest 10% incomes and the highest 10% incomes. So that was the gap. And that gap got smaller in 2020 when the income assistance benefits and the SERB benefits were coming out. So just again, median income is really important to monitor here. And so I'll dive into income inequality, which the help data really helps illustrate. And I'm so happy to be partnering to show the outcomes, because this is the income data, but to see the outcomes for children. So this is the family pie, the family income pie, families with children in BC after-tax income in 2021. And here's the gradient from the lowest decile. So I've just been talking about what that looks like, $11,000 to $282,000 a year. And you can see, we try to give it a way to look at it, that the richest half of the family, so the decile 6 to 10 deciles, families in that upper decile, take home 3/4 of the pie, of the pizza pie, and the bottom half take home 1/4. So just another visual to kind of get you thinking about the what income inequality actually looks like. And I didn't include fact sheet 7 in this slideshow, but if you go to the First Call website and look at the report card this year, there's a tab to look at the maps that we have. And thanks, shout out to Spark BC for helping us produce those maps each year. But you can look at child poverty rates across the province to see how this income gradient plays out in different geographic areas, by regional district, by urban areas. Some of the statistics that I cited earlier, you can see them reflected in those maps, and down to, as the earlier slide that Martine showed of the cities, you can see by census tract in different communities how income inequality plays out in different communities. So that's all the bad stories. Income inequality is growing. It got worse in 2021 after it had shrunk a bit. The gap between the rich and the poor got better in 2020 when a lot of the lower income families were getting some extra support. As that's been withdrawn, the gap now it's 25 times between the top and the bottom again. So here's then what we can do, and looking to the importance of government policy. I've been referring to it a bit already, but it's absolutely crucial. So government transfers, things like COVID benefits in the previous years, but also the Canada Child Benefit, make a huge difference in lowering child and family poverty. So without the transfer payments from government transfer payments in 2021, the child poverty rate, instead of being 14.3%, would have been close to 30%, 29.8 or something like that. So about 30%, there would have been 260,000 poor children instead of 126,000 children poor in that year. So government transfers are incredibly important, and we need to keep our eye on them and encourage government when they're helping. We're helping as a society to lower the poverty rate, but we need to do more of that. So again, what this graph is showing you is, you see the BC in the middle there. What it's showing you is that child poverty would have been, so it was brought down, the reduction rate was by 51.6 or 52% drop in child poverty if there had been no, thanks to government transfers. So that's the power of government transfers, and that kept 134,350 children out of poverty. So we can measure these things quite precisely. And if they didn't have these benefits and didn't have this Canada Child Benefit and didn't have, their incomes would have been much smaller, and we would have had much. So this is really powerful. The BC Child Family Benefit is also there, rolled into the Canada Child Benefit. So those transfers are incredibly important. So we know there are some things we can do. I want to talk quickly about advocacy in action. How am I doing for time, Kate? I'm not watching the clock, but I hope.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
doing
okay. I think carry on, and we'll
Okay.
stay like a little bit at the end, if we even have 10 minutes. We just have one question, so a reminder to people, put your Q&As in the Q&A.
Okay, so I'll try and be really quick here. I wanted to end on a little more positive note. We wanted to so these are some things that we've won. So First Call's been involved in, and lots of others, but in 2010, so for about 14 years, First Call ran the living wage campaign, and we certified employers who voluntarily paid a living wage and signed up every year to the calculation of what a living wage meant. So that's a commitment that has been in place since 2010, and it's lifting a number of families out of poverty, I think, or at least reducing their depth of poverty by paying living wages. In 2015, we had a big campaign to make sure that child support paid mostly by absent fathers who are not, and for families, single mothers on income assistance is primarily the demographic. They weren't allowed to keep the child support that was paid to them. It was deducted from their checks at that time. We did lots of lobbying and advocacy around that. And the year we won that, and they stopped clawing that back, it affected 5,400 children, and obviously thousands of children in the years since. So that's again, the power of public policy why we focus at First Call so much on public policy, because you can affect thousands of children at one time with a good public policy, and hurt a lot of kids if you have bad public policy. 2016, we were on a roll then. There was a situation with maternity benefits, maternity parental benefits being clawed back from families when they were taking their mat leave. And that was stopped, and that affected several hundred parents that year and in all subsequent years. For years we said BC doesn't have a poverty reduction strategy. Where we need some kind of plan. We need to hold ourselves accountable. In 2018, we finally got a legislated Poverty Reduction Strategy Act, and it's with a target in it to reduce child poverty in 5 years by 50%. A couple of other wins. The one at the top here, we're very proud of at First Call because we produced a report, what's called the BC Family Benefit. Now used to be, it started as the early childhood tax benefit. So it only went up to age 6, and that's when it cut off, and it was very small amount. And then in 2019, we presented a report in 2018 to the finance minister of the day and said, other provinces do this better. They go up to age 18, they give more money. We could be doing that too. And they did make the change, and they introduced what was called first the BC Child Opportunity Benefit. It changed its name eventually to the BC Family Benefit, but it now goes up to the 18th birthday, and they doubled the amount. And they have raised it. We're still advocating that it be regularly indexed, but they have raised it in last two subsequent years. Support for youth transitioning out of care has improved. We're working on that still. I would say we haven't quite reached it. Like, really, one of the goals is to make sure that youth aging out of care are guaranteed that they have quality supported housing, that it's affordable. We're not quite there yet, but there's certainly a bunch of steps that have been made. And actually, there's a meeting this afternoon with the Ministry of Children and Family Development to hear from young people about how some of the measures they're putting in place could be tweaked even to offer more support. And lastly, getting children free access to under 12 or 12 and under access to public transit. Now we're working on teens, trying to get that. But so all of these steps are wins that make a big difference in families' lives. I've mentioned childcare a lot. I won't go into great detail here, but you can see the images of some of the key reports. There's our report they're making ends meet, lots of voices. You can see it on our website about the importance of childcare. That came to the top of the list when parents were reporting what was trapping them in poverty. The Family Center for Equity report, A Whole Life, testifying to from some of the parents they interviewed who got into $10 a day childcare spots, and the difference that made in their lives. They could leave, they could get off social assistance. They could take just one job instead of having multiple jobs. They could spend more time with their families and their children. They could do a bunch of things that really affected their health and well-being and their children's health and well-being. So we're still trying to roll that out. Kudos to the 10-a-day people, the early childhood educators of BC and the Coalition of Childcare Advocates of BC. So you can see their roadmap for the 10-a-day childcare in BC there. The government has pretty much adopted or said they will made a commitment to build a public system. There's a lot of consensus at the federal level, there's a lot of advocacy, and the federal government has started chipping in and just passed into legislation the Canada Early Learning and Childcare Act that promises long-term funding and some commitments to making sure that's public and nonprofit investments. So there's real progress on this issue right now. But again, what we know is that as soon as rates for childcare rates were dropped and parent fees were dropped in the last year, of course, a bunch of families who said we could never afford it, that's why I couldn't work, and my whole paycheck would go to that. And now they are on waiting lists because it's taking time to build enough spaces, and also to hire. We need to raise the wages of early childhood educators because there's a recruitment and retention challenge there. It's not well enough paid profession right now, or recognized with an adequate wage. So we're looking for a wage grid in BC to make that a realist. So here's the 25, this is not a list, but in the report, you'll see 25 recommendations for all levels of government. We group them by income supports, which I've been talking a lot about, and you can dig into the specific things we're recommending there. There's targeted initiatives for those groups that are overrepresented again, and I didn't list lone parent families there, but they should be in that list. And then barriers, things like childcare, public health, those universal programs that should be in place, including expanded healthcare coverage, school meals that would help. So adequate funding for public schools, all of those things that, again, help reduce the gradient between families. So what's your influence for issues that matter to you? Just a quick, maybe a little kind of advocacy 101, because we do have an election coming up. So at First Call, we always see election periods. We're nonpartisan, but they're opportunities to raise public awareness, to educate candidates, whether they win or not. If they don't win, they're still educated, hopefully. And if they do win, hopefully we might get some of the proposed policy changes in talking to parties and candidates into, if they get elected, if they become a minister, into those mandate letters that go out to ministers that say, we're going to work on this, or those mandate letters to new ministers are very important. So we're seeking commitments. First Call does an election toolkit for each kind of election that we experience. So seek commitments. These are opportunities, and we'll do our best also to put questions out to parties and then to publish their responses to questions that will pose that affect children and families, children, youth, and families particularly. And of course, people can use social media and all kinds of, go to all candidates meetings. There's a lot of different ways to engage, and even outside of election opportunities, certainly. We're all citizens or residents. We have voting rights, or even if we don't have voting rights, if we're newcomers, we can still talk to elected representatives. We're constituents in various things. So it's sort of looking at our realm of influence. If you're an employee in an organization, you might, in the course of your work, especially for service organizations, or though in certain parts of public services, you can look upstairs and sort of say, tell your team leader or the leadership of your organization what you're seeing and what might need to change. So bearing witness to what you see for children and families that needs to change. Certainly people who have the benefit of a union or professional association can use that avenue to raise issues and have their union help speak for them. And then people are, part of other groups, faith groups, political parties, could be arts group, who knows, but just think about every conversation makes a difference. Yeah.
I'm just gonna interrupt because we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
Coming in, and we only have a few minutes left. I want to get to a couple of them if we could.
Yeah.
So maybe let's bring us all up, Jeremy, if that's possible. And I'll just start with some of the ones that are coming specifically to you. So Mari was asking about, are there efforts, you talked about the transportation for under 12s, and oh, sorry, I got a little message. There we go. And the question is, are there efforts for other transportation systems like Coastal, BC Bus North, and others? I don't know if you have an answer to that, whether they're looking to make transportation free.
Yeah, I don't know the nitty-gritty detail on some of that. I think anything that's public, I think the argument has been that anything that's public transit, so that would be BC Transit and TransLink, have been the chief targets. But I think there's a need for advocacy in other parts of the province. Absolutely.
Right. And I'm not sure that I understand this one, Chantel, but it's the question is, do we know how many families do the 126K children in poverty represent? Oh, you're muted, Adrian.
Just trying not to cough into the.
Oh, good.
So the answer to that is yes, but that's not what we've published. We do have it by family, yes. But I don't have the number in my head. Sorry. We publish it just by children, but there is data about the number of families that are poor. So if someone wants to ask for that, we can find it.
Great. And maybe we'll give you a minute to have a drink of water, and we'll ask that Martine get pulled on, if we could. And just really a question as you're coming on from Patty early on after you presented, just about, and I think it's an opportunity to talk about maybe what the monitoring system data offers in terms of linkage and research potential. So the question is, were any lifestyle besides 1 versus 2 parent homes factored into the research? So for example, time in foster care, effects of drug and alcohol, cultural differences, and how these things might impact outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Patty, for the question. Yeah, of course, I have to acknowledge that today I focused on one sliver of our data, not really trying to just show how income or SES seems to be correlated with so many things, even if we think they're maybe free or so. But what you're raising here, oh, wait, it just now disappeared. It's not answered yet.
Oh, it would be in the answered. Sorry, I did click answered.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so we do have, so for example, cultural differences. We actually have several people in our group, and I've been included in some of these, where we look at, and I know there's different ways of defining cultural differences, you know, what we of course have people coming from different places in the world. We have had the opportunity to link to immigration data and then trace how first, second immigrant children from different language backgrounds, and depending on whether they grew up in high resource or low resource environments, how they're doing over time in terms of their academic outcomes, mental health. So yes, we have research papers. I don't want to take too much time now to go into all these, but you're absolutely right. When we do these work on these publications, sometimes we pick a couple of these and look at the intersectionality, at the combination, or focus on one aspect. And that's certainly taken. I'd love to have a follow-up conversation, because there are quite a few groups who use our data linkages to explore exactly these types of questions, and their publications. So I'm happy to follow up and point you in some directions. I hope this is good for now, that in principle we do look at these things the way you're asking them. Thanks.
And we did put in the chat links to some of the research where you can find on our website research that has been done with monitoring system data, and Help Reads, which is helps monthly publications that are coming out to just opportunities to look to see the kinds of research that's happening. Great. Okay. I have one from Jill. I think it's mainly for Adrian, about anything that jumped out from the recent federal budget announcements for you around these issues.
Sorry, I was just answering a question. Sorry, Jill's question. Yes, anything that jumped out from the recent federal budget announcements? Well, happy to see the investments in school meals. Again, that's not really a poverty reduction measure, but it will help low-income families if we can get a school meal program. So that's coming through. The childcare investments are good. So there was a promise again in there, and to spend more federal dollars through the provinces. Those are two things that's done. There was also the disability Act, or the Disability Canada Disability Act, which there's a tiny amount, I think, given to families there, but it's not enough yet. But it was, at least it's something like $2,400 a year, not very much money. There was something in there. That's just some of the ones off the top of my mind. Yeah.
Certainly a big focus on housing, but I'm not quite clear on how it all will shake down, and to which income levels, etc.
Yeah, I'm not clear on that either. A lot of it around home ownership and stuff like that. So rentals are really the issue. Families can't afford rentals right now. So
yes,
for low income families. Yeah.
And so we just have 2 minutes, and we have two questions. Let's try them. And I think I know you get asked this one, Adrian. So here it comes. We should have predicted it. If you had to prioritize 3 policies to advocate to reduce poverty, what could they be? And I'll just give my one reflection. Whenever you present, I'm reminded about how complex poverty is. Tracking it, reporting it, the systems that support moving us in a good direction. It's so complex. So my hand's up to you and the work that you do to help us understand how complicated it is, and the difference between the depths of poverty, what that means. There's a real range in people living low income to deep poverty. So there's so many factors, and I think these questions are really hard to answer 3 top, but I'll put it out to you anyway.
Well, I'm going to say childcare makes a huge difference. Obviously, we hear that over and over again, and given the high stats for lone parent families, single parent families, that's just that's a deal breaker when you can't get childcare, and even for 2-parent families who need both parents working. That would be my number one. And direct income supports, raising those, doing more of what we do with the Canada Child Benefit or the provincial benefits, making sure that those, and welfare rates, make sure those direct income supports are indexed and brought up to at least the poverty line, or more of that. So some families are raised over the poverty line by the Canada Child Benefit, but it could be better for. We actually made it. I'll just quickly say we could put some of that investment more into lower income families. That's another way to do it. Take some of the higher income families that are getting some of the child benefits and shifting it without even spending more money. That's another way to target a little bit more. One part of the conversation.
Great, thank you. And I see we're at time, so I just want to take a moment to thank you both so much for the presentation. We had some nice thank yous in the chat coming in. Really appreciate everybody's time on the back end who helped us, the helpers that helped us. in various ways technically and making the slides look nice, etc. And grateful for all of you to join us and take your time. And we will be sharing a follow-up email with these links that Adrian is sharing just now, along with the recording when it's available and any links we shared in the chat. And please reach out. You know, we're happy to hear more. Oftentimes wishing these were in person so we could have more conversation, but reach out if you have more questions or through email, and we can set up a time to talk more. So thank you so much to everybody, and we will log off and say goodbye. Thank you, Martine and Adrian.
Well, thank you, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.